Awesome. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to our session on what animal health can teach us. I'm Nick St. Fleur. I'm a science reporter with STAT, where I also host the podcast Color Code, and I will be the moderator for this session. So where are all my animal lovers at? Raise your hands. Yeah. Okay, we have a room full of animal lovers. This is the exact session for you. So I'm joined by an amazing panel of experts. We have Barbara Nadesan-Horowitz, who is the professor of medicine at UCLA School of Medicine and author of the book Zoobiquity. I have Sammy Ramsey, who's the endowed assistant professor of entomology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and also the founder of the Ramsey Research Foundation. And I have Jaime Modiano, who is director of the Animal Cancer Care and Research Program at the University of Minnesota. Now, when you think about animals and human health, you probably think about mostly like zoonotic diseases, diseases that animals, let's say maybe bats or civets carry, that can then, get transferred to humans and cause something like global pandemic. Well, we're not exactly discussing that today. Instead, we're talking more about animal health and what we can learn from, treating them and working with them about our own human health. So in prepping for this panel, I did a bit of a dive into zoobiquity, which is, a combination of evolutionary biology, animal behavior, ecology, and medicine and such. And I learned some cool things, from looking at a lot of your research and some of the YouTube videos you have. I mean, how many people in here knew, that like golden retrievers can get breast cancer, killer whales can get Hodgkin's disease? I don't see as many hands on that. Horses can get melanoma, okay? Pregnant giraffes can get high blood pressure. Dolphins can get genital herpes. Now, that one's not that surprising if you know anything about dolphins. And koalas can get chlamydia. That's kind of interesting there. But there are also, mental and emotional things that they also experience similar to humans. Like dogs can have OCD, and sometimes we see like feather plucking disorder in parrots and other birds. And recently, if you guys are into science news and such, there was this really cool story about a Sumatran orangutan that had a wound on its cheek, and it was able to use a leaf to self-medicate. I mean, animals and human health, it's super cool. It's super intertwined as well. And we're going to learn so much more about that during this session. So to start us off, Barbara, you wrote the literal book on zoobiquity right here. Tell us a little bit about, this field of zoobiquity, and how did you kind of get started in it? I understand your background is you're a cardiologist. How did animals come into your world?
Right. So, I'm a cardiologist and an evolutionary biologist, and I spent the first about 20 years of my career as a professor of medicine, cardiology. But for the last 10 years, I've been studying the connections between human and animal health, and I've become convinced that answers for maybe all, certainly most of the most vexing human health challenges that we have can be found in the natural world, particularly across the animal kingdom. And so what I do is to innovate strategies to find those answers, transform them into solutions, which we can then bring back to the human bedside. And some of the solutions are high-tech, some are very low-tech, some are non-invasive, low-tech, incredibly, startlingly inexpensive. So then, with all the answers the question is, why are we talking about this today as something in the future and not something that's happening with patients already? The answer we can talk about, what I think, but Zoobiquity, the book, I wrote with Catherine Bowers to change that, to really bring together human medicine, animal medicine, because after all, humans are animals. And, you could say that, to have an artificial divide is not scientifically sound. I also started conferences called Zoobiquity conferences, where we bring together physicians and veterinarians, like top veterinary cardiologists have conversations about atrial fibrillation in horses with top human cardiologists who talk about atrial fibrillation in humans. And we've done that for cancer, cardiac, lots of psychiatry. I'm very interested in mental illness, mental health across the tree of life. So Zoobiquity, bringing together two cultures, Zo, Greek for animal, ubiquity, Latin for everywhere.
Sticking with you here, Barbara, what was that story? What was that moment that really flipped the switch for you where you realized, I should really look into the whole animal world as well?
Yeah. So, back in 2005, if you had asked me, hey, what's the connection between human and animal health? I would have said zoonoses, right? And that probably would have been the end of it. But In about 2005, the LA Zoo had some great apes who had cardiovascular issues, and they wanted a human cardiologist to come and work alongside the veterinarians, and I became their cardiovascular consultant. And over the course of years, I saw so many commonalities. I learned so much from veterinarians, and I was humbled in a way that I would have thought impossible about how little I knew as a physician, how much I could learn.
I love that. I love that. Sammy, you are the insect man, the insect
Accurate.
Superman. If you're not into bugs, you will be after having a conversation with this guy, let me tell you. So Sammy, tell us first about yourself, and I guess that intersection between, what we learn about insects, their social behaviors, their health, and human health.
For sure. So, as you already know, I'm an entomologist, but I've been an entomologist for a long time. You might be looking at me thinking, how long could it really be, buddy? But I told my parents when I was 7 that I wanted to be an entomologist, and it was really because prior to that, I was terrified of insects. And my parents were like, what are we going to do about this? Because the irrational fear was taking over. My mom actually got a call from my first grade teacher. She's like, hi, Miss Ramsey. Sammy, we're having a little bit of a problem with him. He hasn't been going outside to recess. He told us, quote, I don't want to meet any insects on their own turf. So it's
A quote.
I was a quirky little kiddo, but my parents recognized with my insatiable curiosity the best way to help would be to leave me with this idea. People fear what they don't understand. So they parked me in my local library in the entomology section for an entire summer, and by the end of that summer, I told them I wanted to be an entomologist when I grew up. And I have not deviated from that path in any direction. It's always been entomology. But at the same time, one of the things that I found the most fascinating about insects was just how much their interests, their motivations, their behaviors parallel our own. I used to think of them as so foreign, such alien organisms. A lot of people don't even realize that they are indeed animals. I was just having a conversation this morning on a nature walk, and someone was saying, well, they're not like animals, all right? Well, what other option is there? Fungi, bacteria, plants. So it's one of those things where the more I read about them, the more I connected with them and understood the different things that they were doing. I was always the smallest person in all of my classes. I was 40 pounds in the second grade. I was a tiny little kiddo, and I was 110 when I graduated college. So not much change there. But I recognized that these tiny little organisms were capable of doing such huge things. Even though they're some of the smallest animals out there, they accomplish incredible things. They're constantly punching above their weight class, and they inspired me to try to do the same. So when it also comes to insects, what I find really fascinating is that there are a lot of elements of their health that parallel really important things about our own. And when we excise insects from our world, it is to our detriment. You should have bugs in your house. Just make sure they're the bugs that you want in your house. The ones that we are typically the most afraid of are not the ones that we should be running from. The centipedes, the spiders, they are protecting you. They are the first line of defense against cockroaches, termites, and bed bugs. And yet, those are the ones that we're running after with a broom and trying to smash, and we just don't fully understand how connected they are with our health. They are animals, and we are animals, and we have to make sure that there is a balance between us to maintain health.
The bugs in the room right now are like, yes,
Yes,
King,
exactly.
continue, yes. So, Jaime, tell us also a bit about yourself and your research looking at, cancer in dogs, and what does that tell us about human health, and I guess also vice versa.
Yeah. Well, how can I top this? I served a sentence in Texas for some time, and in our house in Texas, we didn't have any horrible ticks that carried disease because the fire ants ate them all.
See?
I trained through the combined program at Penn in veterinary medicine and got a PhD in immunology. So, vet school is kind of rigorous, but the only thing I really learned is that a cat is not a small dog. And that actually, in hindsight, has served me pretty well, and you'll understand why in a minute. I did my PhD in the laboratory of Dr. Peter Knoll, who is really the father of modern cancer genetics. He is the guy who discovered the Philadelphia chromosome. And he would joke with me saying, oh, you're going to be a dog doctor. You should go discover the Philadelphia chromosome in dogs. And at the time, I thought he was kind of loony. But then sometime later, I actually did. So my colleague Matthew Breen and I discovered the Philadelphia chromosome in chronic myelogenous leukemia in dogs. which I actually thought was going to be impossible, and I lost a really nice case of wine on the bet with Matthew, but we did discover that. And it made kind of a splash because, you know, the same disease in humans, dogs carrying the same genetic abnormality, all this connection. And I realize now that chronic myelogenous leukemia is the greatest joke that nature played on us, because we've made some amazing discoveries and assumed that it was the model for everything else. And it turns out that it's the outlier quirk. Oh. And so we went on to try to look for all these other similarities in dog cancer and human cancer, based on what we found in chronic myelogenous leukemia, and we realized that it just wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so after, you know, a 40-year career, I've learned the second thing that was really important. A dog is not a small person. Mm. So we started...
Some people think they are.
Even myself included when I'm not at work, right? Yes. But we started thinking, you know, why is there this parallel of dogs and humans getting so much cancer in their lifetime, and other animals in the animal kingdom, in zoos, and as much as we can tell in the wild, not really being afflicted, you know, where 30% of the population is getting cancer. And there really was this insightful moment in discussions we're having with our group where we basically said, you know, dogs and humans are the only species that in the span of 200 years for humans and 50 years for dogs have exceeded their allotted time on Earth. So when we evolve as species, when species evolve all the way from, you know, invertebrates all the way to humans, plants, the adaptation that creates a species includes a lot of things, including lifespan. So species are adapted to a particular lifespan. And if you actually dig a little bit into the history of humans, it turns out that until the 1850s, maybe the 1790s, so somewhere in that neighborhood, humans really only lived about 45 to 50 years. And yes, it was highly influenced by infant mortality, but, and yes, there were a few people that were 80 or 90, but for the most part, you know, your expected lifespan was about 40. Mm-hmm. And for dogs, in the wild, the expected lifespan, again, a lot of infant mortality, but it's about 4. And so when humans turn 41, essentially, we're living on borrowed time. And when dogs turn 4.1, they're living on borrowed time. And so we looked across the whole spectrum of the animal kingdom, and we realized that there's all of these really cool cancer protective mechanisms we're finding across the animal world in elephants and in mole rats and in parrots and in sharks and so on. And they're not getting cancer, and humans and dogs are, so maybe we didn't get our cancer protective mechanisms, but in fact we did. Mm-hmm. They just only work for some time. And so if any of you work for the auto industry, I don't mean to insult anyone, but you can buy a Ford and drive it for 50,000 miles, or you can buy a Toyota and drive it for 400,000 miles, right? Wow. So the short-lived species are the Ford, right, and the long-lived species are the Toyota, and they're meant to last that long. It doesn't mean you can't drive a Ford past 50,000 miles, but then you got to put an oil pump and a muffler and a new engine. And so that's what's happening to us, right? Oh, wow. And part of that is that our intrinsic cancer protective mechanisms, whatever those are that we don't understand, are intimately tied to aging. Mm-hmm. And so as we actually go through chronic aging and we see all of these chronic aging diseases that afflict the population of humans and dogs, as we were talking about, all of those are happening after we essentially exceeded our evolutionarily adapted lifespan. So our research now is trying to really understand that and think about, can we mitigate it, can we prevent it? And so last night, Dr. Kundu said she developed an artificial intelligence program that could detect osteoarthritis in healthy people 5 years before it happened. And I'm like, damn, she stole my thunder, because I was going to tell you, we've developed 3 platforms where we can actually take healthy dogs that are in the 4+ age range, and we can actually categorize them based on a simple blood test by risk of who is at higher risk of developing cancer and who's not. So one of the conversations yesterday, like, well, that's great, but what are you going to do about it, right? Hi, Mrs. Smith, your golden retriever is going to get cancer in 2 years, but go home and have a nice day, because there's nothing like that. So the cool thing that we've done is we have developed an intervention. And so far, the emerging data are really promising that this intervention can actually change the environment and potentially prevent cancer and other diseases of age.
That's very fascinating, and I'd love to learn some more as well. But one thing I want to say to the audience here is that we would love for this to be as interactive as possible. You all said you are animal lovers. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. So we're not going to wait until the last 15 minutes. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get a mic runner to you, and you can just share it, and then we'll have this amazing group of experts up here answer it. So first, I want to go back to you, Barbara, though. Are there any other specific stories from all of your work that really stick to you where you were just thinking to yourself, like, wow, learning about this in XYZ animal, how do we apply this to humans? Or can we apply this to humans? Or why hasn't anyone applied this to humans?
It's been happening for a decade, and it continues to happen. So just in terms of cancer, I remember when I was first doing research for zoobiquity, human oncologists, friends of mine, colleagues would say, dogs get melanoma, dogs get osteosarcoma, dogs get, there was they looked shocked. Now that's changed, maybe a little bit from the work that I've been doing, but still there's this human exceptionalism, this idea, and it's rampant in medicine, in human medicine, this idea that we are somehow uniquely unique and that we are, yes, sure, certainly we're animals. There's kind of an objective understanding of that, but sort of on a personal level, a feeling that we're really unique. So a couple of specific stories. One has to do with maternal health, and one is with mental health. I'm looking at mental health in other species a lot these days. Thank God, centuries of debate about whether animals do or don't have emotions. That debate is done, asked and answered. They do. So now we can actually learn from that. But maternal health, so breastfeeding, right? The lifelong benefits of breastfeeding are clearly established for moms and for kids, for babies. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 2 years of breastfeeding. Less than 20% of American women can do a year. A lot of them stop because of a painful infection in the breast duct called mastitis. And so I started wondering a few years ago, I wonder if what was at stake, instead of it being women's health, which is often ignored, if it was a billion-dollar industry. So I turned to the dairy industry, and I turned to a couple of dairy veterinarians, and it turns out there are about 100 years' worth of research on preventing mastitis in dairy animals. They have non-invasive, startlingly inexpensive approach to preventing it. And I go on rounds with this dairy vet in Central California. At the cow side, they take a paddle the size of a cutting board that was in your backpack, right? It's literally a wooden paddle, and there are 4 petri dishes on it. And as the cow is being, the milking process is happening, they take a few drops of milk, put it in the petri dish. That test, okay, has a 90% sensitivity, 90% for detecting what's called subclinical mastitis. In other words, the cow doesn't even have symptoms. There are just some inflammatory white cells in the milk. Now, you'd think that 90% sensitivity, and guess how much it costs? There's a one-time upfront cost of the paddle, $5 to $15.
Right.
And each test is 10 to 25 cents. So, and they have an intervention which is equally non-invasive. So the question is, why on earth hasn't this been brought into human medicine?
Why on earth hasn't this been brought into
Human exceptionalism. You guys are tired of me saying it, but it is a blindfold. It is a scientific blindfold. It just keeps... it prevents us from recognizing connections. And I think the tendency to think, oh, well, we're humans, those are cows. Come on. Instead of, we're both mammals. The biology of lactation is highly conserved across all mammalian species. We look at difference, we don't look at commonality, and as a result, we miss so much. Human exceptionalism.
Let's talk about insect exceptionalism.
Well, they are pretty exceptional.
Right, they are. Sammy, so has there been anything particularly, surprising that you've come across with studying insects that make you just think why are we looking at this in humans? Or, this could be applied to us.
Absolutely. Insects, they are the most diverse group of animals on this planet by a wide margin. Close to 80% of the animals on this planet are insects. And so what that should tell you is that they have gotten very good at what they do. they're incredibly successful, and that success comes from diversity. So you'll see a lot of different ways of interacting with the world in the world of insects, a lot of ways of solving problems. That's one of the chief reasons why, just from a selfish standpoint, we should be trying to conserve the populations within the environment, because they represent more than 1 million ways to solve the problems that nature throws at us. And that's more than 1 million ways that we don't have to reinvent the wheel if we just look to the ways that they have already solved various problems. So some of the antibacterial and antimicrobial products that they produce are off the charts, really, really, really good at what they do. Now, I work with pollinators primarily. I like to call myself an equal opportunity entomologist, but the bees pay the bills. I need you to know, the bees themselves have solved a ton of problems quite remarkably. One of the things that I love seeing in a honeybee colony is just how fastidious they are about keeping that place clean. And the way that they do it, they go out and they collect resin from trees. When trees are damaged by an organism, they don't have a lot of options for what to do about it, and so they flush this resin to wherever the wound is, hoping to flush the creature out that is trying to eat them. This is how organisms get trapped in amber and end up on Jurassic Park. But the great thing about it is that the bees have recognized there are some antimicrobial products here, but they're in very low levels. What do we do about this? Well, they take them, they evaporate a bunch of the water out of it through evaporative cooling by fanning their wings over it, actually evaporating water out of it. So it concentrates the antimicrobial products. It also makes it extremely sticky. And then they use this as a glue, and they line all the surfaces of their colonies with it. Well, they always do this with rough surfaces, and they're typically inside of a tree and constantly interacting with the bark of a tree hole. But we as humans have put them inside of these really smooth, really nice boxes. And so they don't always recognize this is a surface that I need to cover in propolis. So one of the things that some really remarkable and enterprising researchers considered was, what if we just rough up the wood a bit? Would the bees cover this in their antibacterial goo? And will that antibacterial goo actually help them fight off viruses and bacteria? Yes. Yes, it did work. And one of the things that we also recognized is that a lot of the antibacterial resistant bacteria that we deal with can be killed by this propolis, by some of the components of their honey, and it's used often in other countries. But over here,
Nope.
I think it might be that human exceptionalism thing again.
Oh, man.
What would the insects be doing producing something that's worthwhile to us with a brain that's 1/5 the size of a grain of rice? Like, could they really have come up with anything that's worthwhile to us? And it's really sad considering there are people who are in burn wards right now who are dealing with infections that are antibiotic resistant that they can't seem to get rid of. And in other countries, they would apply a bandage covered in manuka honey or other forms of honey that have antibacterial responses to them. And that whole situation would clear up quite dramatically. The cells that grow there also grow better because they're able to scaffold better against the wound, so that when you take that bandage off, you don't end up recreating a wound situation. But that's not what we do here.
Darwin has a great quote: "Nature is a power to innovate immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts."
Oof.
Wow.
Say it, Darwin. Say it, Darwin.
But before I go back to audience questions, I love that say it, Darwin. Jaime, tell me, from your area of expertise, what kind of role does human exceptionalism play there? Do you find challenges that are preventing you from, translating what we're finding in dogs and all of that to humans? What are the barriers you face?
Yeah, I think that there's the pendulum swinging in both directions, right? So there's no similarity between humans and animals all the way to they're identical. Mm-hmm. So I think that we've been through a long period. I feel this really interesting because we've created enthusiasm and then we've messed it up and it's died, and then we've had to recreate enthusiasm and we've messed it up. And I think that you create this enthusiasm by pointing out the similarities, right? As Barbara was mentioning. And then people start thinking, an orangutan that's putting poultice on its face is just the same as a human. And we forget about how much we learn from differences, and the strength of diversity across everything that we do. And so I think that one of the challenges has been actually sort of going back and erasing dogma, because just because it's written in a textbook is not always right. Challenging dogma and facing that pushback that says, no, you know, why are you telling me that there's so many differences between particular tumor in a dog, you know, melanoma in a dog and melanoma in a person, because they look the same. And I say, well, you know, a bat wing and a bird wing look the same too, right? So we really have to think about both divergent and convergent evolution. And I think that those are real barriers.
And I definitely want to get into like evolutionary medicine and evolutionary biology and how it plays a part in all of your research. And I loved how, you know, you as a dog researcher are trying to overturn dogma in your field. So I caught that pun. I caught it. But people in the audience, animal lovers here, any questions we have? What's coming to mind? Right here, this woman right here in the front in the pink. We have a microphone coming to you. 1 second. And if you don't mind keeping your questions to just kind of questions, so we can get as many as we can.
Okay, my name is Bryna. My husband and I work on malaria in Western Kenya. We have a big project going on there. Okay. Tell me why mosquitoes, what benefit there is.
Wow, she chose violence.
I mean, let's get right to the issue.
Let's get to it. Let's get straight to it. Now, I want y'all to know, as somebody who's been an entomologist for a long time, I have received several iterations of that question, but the question that I've received the most has just been, ew, why would you want to do that? And so I've spent a lot of time figuring out how to really get people to understand what is so fascinating about insects, what's so helpful about insects, even the ones that we typically think of as the ne'er-do-wells of the bug world. Well, ticks, fleas, mosquitoes, people can typically never think of a good quality about them. And even ecologically, we think we could probably just get rid of them in the environment and suffer no harm as a result of it, right? Mosquitoes have led to the deaths of pretty much more humans than any other creature. Fleas would be right behind that with all the issues from the Black Plague. But we learn a ton from these organisms. Parasites are terrifying, but they are the organisms that I study the most, because the way that they interact with the organisms that they use as hosts allows us to far better understand ourselves as a result. We have a better understanding of our immune system as a result of interactions with parasites. We have a better understanding of even matters like our microbiome and even our mental health because of the things that parasites do that modulate and change those things. So if we consider when a mosquito lands on you, have any of you noticed before that you can be bitten by a dozen mosquitoes and never notice it until you start itching a few hours later? That's because there's actually an anesthetic in their saliva. They don't want you to know that they are there. So evolution has built in a system that's allowed for them to establish an anesthetic that can numb the sensation that you would normally feel. That has helped us better understand local anesthetization. In addition to that, the anticoagulants that are in their saliva that allow for the blood to keep flowing are effective anticoagulants for human beings. Not every anticoagulant works on every human being's blood chemistry. And so to have different versions of them that we learn about through mosquitoes, through ticks, through fleas is really useful. Every single organism has something to teach us because every organism has faced the problems that the natural world throws at it. The natural world is incredibly hostile. And so the buildup of evolutionary responses is something that we need to learn from, even though some of these creatures literally suck.
Sammy, I will remember that next time I go, pop!
Yeah, exactly.
That's spot one. Other audience questions? We have one over there. Did you?
Hi there. I'm still not sold on the mosquitoes, but I appreciate that. You've been talking a lot about the physiology, the things that we can learn between animal and human physiology. I'm really curious about the access piece. So what we find is when people care about their animals, that is a gateway in oftentimes to helping them to care for themselves. I'm in Austin. I work with Austin Pets Alive. We have seen more benefit when we take care of a homeless person's animal than that person who is experiencing homelessness. We're actually able to start bringing them into primary care. So can you say more about how we're using animals to help us with access, mental health, and I think a really good example, I just came out of the climate change one, the number of times people will not leave their homes and being told to evacuate because they won't leave their animals. So how can we use that animal-human relationship to actually improve access and care, people getting into primary care?
Thank you. Barbara, go right ahead.
That is a wonderful question, and it really speaks exactly to One Health, right? So One Health is this idea, well, it's not an idea, it's a reality that the health of humans, animals, and the environment are interconnected. And it plays out in all kinds of ways if we have the glasses on to recognize it. And so absolutely we see many examples of, for example, people go into places, rural, remote places where there are animals who are endangered species, that they want to help endangered species. And the only way you're going to be able to help animals who are in a remote place that are endangered is to make sure you're also helping the human populations. You have to be thinking at the same time. And yes, there are wonderful examples of programs for homeless adolescents, which pairs them with animals who may or may not, maybe in different circumstances, may not be. There really is a recognition of this. One of the pieces of the puzzle is mental health. And you talk about human exceptionalism being a blindfold. It's a blindfold about recognizing cancer similarities. Where it is a thick blindfold is when it comes to mental health. There is still this idea that, humans develop psychiatric disorders, but animals, that's a human problem, it's not an animal problem. Well, first of all, I think we all know now, if we have dogs and animals in our home, that is not the case. And on top of that, it turns out that if you think about biodiversity, not just as sort of beautiful colored animals in the rainforest, but as neurodiversity. Across the animal kingdom, any animal that has a brain or a central nervous system of any kind, including invertebrates, including insects, if it can be healthy, it can be unhealthy. And we see across species anxiety, across vertebrates, depression. Depression has an evolutionary purpose. It evolved about 450 million years ago in social fish. And there's a huge amount we can learn about that. But the point is that very often human medicine does not have a One Health view. We look at the human, we don't think about the animal. We don't, for example, think about risks in the environment. If you're a human living in a home where there's a smoker, you're at risk secondhand smoke. We know that it can create all kinds of problems, including lung cancer. We know that dogs, long-snouted dolichocephalic dogs, right, greyhounds and collies, if they're living with someone who's a smoker, they have a higher risk of nasal cancer. Pugs and other brachius bulldogs have higher risks of lung cancer. Same home, same exposure. If you are a woman living in coastal, along the St. Lawrence estuary, right, northeast of Quebec City, there have been for thousands of years beluga whales who have healthy groups of beluga whales. In 1983, they start to die. There's a die-off between 1983 and 1989 of belugas, those beautiful animals. They don't know why. It's a huge mystery. Ultimately, necropsies showed that they were riddled with cancer, and 25% of the female beluga whales had breast cancer or ovarian cancer. Cetaceans, when they get cancer, they typically get leukemias and lymphomas, not breast cancer, not ovarian cancer. And it turns out, of course, that there was an aluminum smelting facility that was upstream, spewing out polyaromatic hydrocarbons, hugely carcinogenic. But here's the thing. That was presented. How many physicians knew about that? Now we look back and we are able to show the increased incidence of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and other health issues related to those contaminants. We have to open our eyes and see that connection, and it's not the way young physicians are taught.
That just really just makes me think about, the environmental toxins and what that could also be doing to local populations in the areas. We talk about this phrase, the canary in the coal mine, right? That's literally kind of what you're talking about in that sense. I see some more audience questions right here in the front.
Thank you. This panel is awesome. I'm learning so much.
Say your name.
Oh, I'm Janet Tomiyama. I'm a professor at UCLA with you in the Department of Psychology. So the insect ick factor, insect protein is a really sustainable source of protein that could really solve the environment and nutrition, but I think it's going to be hard to get humans to eat that. Do you have any ideas?
It is human health.
Yeah,
Protein.
very much so. So insect protein is one of those things that it's got a long and storied history that has unfortunately been tinged with also some elements of systemic racism. Hey, systemic racism, our old friend. Now, he back again. He back
Always
again.
finds a way in there.
Always. Like, you again? So, as I'd like to speak to the white people in the room for a moment. There was a time where insect protein was considered to be a great way of sustaining populations because there were bugs everywhere. A lot of people were consuming it, but it was primarily outside of the Western world. And then a number of European people who felt that they needed to establish an idea of what it meant to be separate from the animals had this perspective that, and they would always come up with something. This is what separates us from the animals. Then they would find an animal doing it and be like, dang it. All right. and so they had to shift this perspective several times. But one of the directions that they shifted it in was, we don't eat insects. That's gross. That's for uncivilized humans and so on. And so in creating this narrative, they applied it as well to people who are of darker complexion and said that, the other races, that's how you know that they are less evolved than white people because they're out here eating insects and so on. So when they met the Native Americans were like, why are y'all starving? You don't have to starve. Oh my gosh. Okay, so it's been a little bit. Let me just tell you, next year, cicadas are going to come out. Just eat them. And they did emerge, and the Native American populations flourished, just rounding up all the cicadas, cooking them, eating them. They talked about the bounty that it was for these cicadas to show up. And white people would rather die than touch these organisms, and it was really sad. And when I think about the ways that systemic racism still at this point has people believing that there is something absolutely disgusting and that it is low class and just something that happens over there in those other countries, but that's because they aren't as civilized as us. Those undertones, those undercurrents are still there. We have reached a point where we are at crisis levels for climate change. And one of the clearest things that we can do is change our eating habits. We don't have to stop consuming animal-based protein. We could actually consume animal-based protein that is much better for the environment. It can be much more sustainably sourced. Insects use just a fraction of the land that cows and other creatures use. They produce just a fraction of the carbon and use just a fraction of the water. Do you guys know what is actually the most sustainable and most nutritious milk on the planet? Anybody want to take a crack at it? Who we got? What? Grubs. No. Aphid milk? No.
What is
It's
it?
actually cockroach milk.
Oh, okay.
I know.
That's the problem.
I feel you. But here's the thing, y'all. Here's the thing. We just need to label it as something. We don't want the cockroach on the bottle, but one day in Whole Foods, you're going to walk through the alternative milk aisle. You're going to see my face on a bottle and going to be like, come on, y'all. Come on, get you this alternative milk, because it is more than 6 times more nutritively dense than cow's milk, uses just a fraction of the energy and carbon, and it actually doesn't taste bad. So I've had it. I did an episode of Radio Lab where me and one of the hosts actually tasted cockroach milk, and it was good stuff.
Don't worry, next year it'll be in the gift bag that asks you all. We have a question in the back.
The question is how
there.
many people would rather
Right
die
there.
than eat and drink salmon.
Back. We'll put her in a moment afterwards. Go right ahead,
Hey.
stand up and say your name, sir.
Hi, Anatol Manzi here. I'm Deputy Chief Medical Officer at Partners in Health, and I don't know if that's going to happen, if I'm going to try that.
I'm going to keep working on it.
And definitely, also mosquitoes. I have been hunting mosquitoes for many years, especially in many African countries where we support, because malaria is one of the, is actually #1 cause of morbidity and mortality in many countries. Anyway, it's going to take me a while, but it's really a learning experience. I'm really fascinated by this session. I think we have learned so much in terms of that intersectionality, and from science to action. Now that's where my question is, especially John, my colleague from Partners in Health, just reminded me that one of our colleagues at the University of Global Health Equity uses one of your books, Barbara.
Phaedra Henley.
Phaedra, yeah.
We're having our first African zoobiquity conference at UGHE. We're about to start planning it. Yes,
that's really
excited,
good.
yes.
I invite everyone here to come over to Rwanda.
Yes.
So,
but getting to your question, sir.
yeah, my question is. This is actually how I'm learning from the insects because they keep just going there. My question is, why is it taking too long to implement some of these best practices and solutions, just from science to action? Thanks. And what opportunities are there?
Yes. And I think we could actually apply that to everyone's expertise here in terms of, what we're learning about animal health. Why is it taking so long to bring it over? I know, Barbara, you were talking about human exceptionalism, but Jaime, what about from your perspective?
Well, I mean, building on human exceptionalism, I think there's a lot of cultural issues that Sammy's already alluded to. And I think it all boils down to politics and investment. I mean, I think that, you have to go where the money is. And sometimes we have to frame our ideas in a way that are appealing or at least not insulting to people that have cultural or exceptional views so that we can do what we need to do. I think that that's a big part of the problem really lies on ignorance, willful or otherwise.
And I think that there's an element of hierarchies. So there are hierarchies all over medicine, like different fields, different specialties within medicine, there's hierarchies. And I think it's very clear that there still are many, many physicians and I think in medical schools who kind of see themselves as superior to veterinarians and to veterinary schools. I hope that's not still the case, but when I was researching zoobiquity about 15 years ago, I would interview veterinarian after veterinarian who would talk about being condescended to by their own physicians. It's harder to get into veterinary school than medical school. There are veterinary cardiologists, oncologists, behaviorists, and you don't learn any of that in medical school, right? So there's human exceptionalism where we think that our species is superior to other species. We're not uniquely unique and we're not superior. But then there's this professional piece of it. And I think one of the barriers is a lack of humility on the part of physicians and medical institutions that have agency to recognize the value of these insights from the veterinary world and the value that can be brought over to the human side. What have we learned from 20 years of the comparative genomics revolution? We have learned that there are differences, but there's a hell of a lot of commonality. And our human exceptionalism, whether it's from the Judeo-Christian tradition or whatever the cause of it, is so deeply embedded that I think we vastly underestimate the value of those animal insights for primary care, cardiovascular care, cancer care, even psychiatric care of humans.
I'm going to add one thing really quickly, and that is that there's two sides to this coin that you described. One is that there might be hubris on one side, but I think that there's also this lack of self-confidence. And so you've got three people in front of you that are just a little outspoken, right? But when we look at the veterinary profession over the last 20, 30 years, it has become primarily a female profession. It's mostly young white women that are entering the workforce. We need, there's a lot of things that we need, but I think one of the things that happens in our society is that women are not taught self-confidence. And so by the time they get to this pinnacle of professional accomplishment, they look at their physician on the other side and they do not have the confidence to discuss, confront, be on equal terms. And so I think that, one of the things that we need to do is go all the way back to kindergarten, because when they get to vet school, it's too late. And think about how can we actually take our kids from the time they're this little and start instilling these values of equity and inclusion across genders, across ethnicity, ancestry, all of these things, because by the time we get them, we have to work with what we have. And having trained many, many women in my career, I find that the hardest thing that I have to do is convince them of how amazingly smart and capable they are. Once I can get there, then all I need to do is stay out of the way, not ruin them. But first I have to help them lift themselves. I can't lift them up myself. I have to help them lift themselves up and then run away and let them be great. And I think that the more we can do that, the more we solve the problem on the side of I'm just a nurse. I'm just a veterinarian. And I say there's never just because without that thing, the system breaks apart.
By the
So I
way,
think that's a really
my
important thing.
epiphany, my aha, I mean, I've met so many veterinarians who either politely or a little bit less politely have said they had those epiphanies, just going through training. They're humans and they're studying animals. So it's, by the way, I was shocked by some of the stories I heard that were so disrespectful. And I couldn't imagine how the veterinarians could tolerate it. And I remember many times a joke that they tell at physicians' expense. So veterinarians are, when they're not seen for the scientists and the clinicians that they are, it's frustrating. So, and imagine, when you're a veterinarian, you have to learn how to take, I'm a human cardiologist, so I know how to take care of atrial fibrillation and atherosclerosis and heart failure, but in Homo sapiens, right? One of 30 million animal species on Earth. Veterinarians, you have to learn how to take care of heart failure and atrial fibrillation in everybody, all those animals. So they
And
have
people too.
They have a joke behind our backs, which is, I think, quite funny. They say, what do you call a doctor who can only take care of one species? A physician.
So I want to get to one more quick audience question here, and then I have a couple of my own. But yes, if you can keep it quick.
Annie Tobias from Ontario, the Ontario Health System. Best panel yet in the whole of the Aspen conference. Just this notion of human exceptionalism driven by arrogance, I can understand it in terms of intellectually, in terms of physicians, etc. What I just fail to understand is the fear behind it in the population at large. What are we so scared of as human beings? Why do I get called, stop anthropomorphizing, for example? If somebody says that to me one more time. Right?
God, I'll join your support group.
Right. So what are we
Because
scared
people
of?
are afraid to die. That's why. People are afraid to die, and they have to believe that we get an afterlife and nobody else does.
But the answer. So how many people at some point in their education were told that when you see a behavior in an animal that resembles human behavior, that you should be very cautious? The first principle is to not anthropomorphize, right? Okay, we all had that. Now, fast forward to, I heard that first in 5th grade. That was like many decades ago. Now, fast forward to 2024. What have we learned from comparative genomics, right? Including the brain comparative genomics, that brain shapes behavior. Okay, we know that we are highly aligned. I mean, dogs and humans, in terms of the genetic profile that shapes behavior and affect, like over 93, 94%. So scientifically, if you're going to look at a behavior in a non-human animal and then think it looks like a human animal, is it more scientifically appropriate to assume that we're so unique that that's anthropomorphizing, that you're projecting a human characteristic onto an animal in an unscientific way? Or is it more scientifically valid, based on what we know about the shared genome, to assume similarity? And then maybe you're going to be right or wrong. So it's time that we move away from that.
I had one last kind of contact question before we kind of wrap up here. We were talking very briefly about evolutionary medicine and evolutionary biology. Could you guys tell us just a little bit about what is this field, and how do we kind of how do we make it happen in that sense? What is evolutionary medicine? Whoever wants to take it.
Sammy, go for it.
I mean, I'm not a physician, so evolutionary medicine isn't quite my thing, but
But you deal with health of insects.
Or how evolutionary biology can help us better understand human health.
for sure. So insects are one of the premier organisms for studying evolutionary biology. Their generation times are really fast, and so it gives you the opportunity to really see evolution in action pretty rapidly. And so we've learned a lot about these organisms, and a lot of it we have been able to even apply to ourselves. When we look at the genetics of fruit flies, a lot of what we have learned about our own genetics started with us studying what it looks like in insects and in flower beetles and other small organisms through which we could control and develop that dynamic. Evolution applies to every living organism, and some not living stuff like viruses. Anything that's got a genetic code is subject to evolution. And so understanding it across the board is really important, and that's very also important to the question that you asked a moment ago about what it is that we are afraid of. I think it does actually make us very nervous that we're not as separate from the rest of the world. The rest of the world seems so chaotic and uncivilized, and we have to remember that we were just a part of all of that chaos not very long ago, and then somebody built a house, and we were like, oh, we're different.
So last question as we wrap up the panel here. So what's one kind of key lesson from your research into animal health that you want the audience here to take away and maybe apply to their own health? Jaime, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think that maybe if there's anything that you can take away from what you've heard from the panel and from me in particular, think differently about aging and what that means. So when we think about aging, we tend to associate that with individual things. And I think that as we think about, can we prevent cancer, for example? And I'm going to say the answer is going to be yes in many cases, we can, but are we doing people any good, right? So are we preventing cancer just to have some other catastrophic illness a little bit later that's even worse than that? So I think that what we need to think about is not just this context of isolating our diseases in a niche, but really thinking about health holistically. And so we're thinking about attacking cancer from the systemic causes and risks, mitigating the risks, but always thinking about what does that mean and promoting healthy aging.
Thank you. Sammy?
Let's think differently about play. I know that that's not something that everyone thinks of as a necessity, but we as human beings work really hard, and then sometimes we try to one-up each other by talking about how much harder we work than this other person. Oh, I haven't had a nap in 4 years. Oh my gosh, I don't know what a nap is. I work 18 hours a day. We really need to stop that and actually revel a bit more in the beauty of play. Yes, human beings, we work a fair bit, but that time that we spend actually playing is really helpful for us, and we can see all the way through the animal kingdom down to the insects that play is critical to them being able to do the work that they do. We have a saying, busy as a bee. Bees can only be busy because they also play. There are aspects of what seems to be culture that is developed in even the ways that they play. Some of you may have even seen the videos of bumblebees playing with these wooden balls of different colors, jumping on them, rolling them around. Even when there's the opportunity for them to get a reward, a food reward, they consistently go after play. They grab the balls, roll them around, play with them, play with other bees, and it's adorable, but it also reminds us that that same element that's helping them exist and helping them develop their brains and be efficient in the work that they do is something that we need as well.
Sammy, thank you for that. You're teeing up because I actually have a session later today on play around 4 p.m. So
okay.
I didn't even know you were going to say that. Barbara, take us home here.
Okay, well, very briefly, when we get sick, we often feel very bad about it. Often we stigmatize ourselves. There's a lot of stigma around disease, around mental health, of course, mental illness, but even around cancer. And I think this perspective that health and disease exist across the tree of life, that in fact vulnerability to cancer is a byproduct of being a multicellular animal. It emerged 600 million years ago. It's a flip side of being an animal. That vulnerability to sickle cell disease is a byproduct of an evolution of a protection against malaria. And that even vulnerability to mental illness is the product of, there's an evolutionary story that is not unique to our species that connects us with all of these other animals. And I think that if we can recognize that physical health and physical illness, mental health and mental illness occur across the tree of life, we can really begin to decrease stigma and recognize that all of that is natural.
Barbara, thank you so much. All of you, thank you so much for joining us. Please give a strong round of applause to our amazing panelists here. A big thank you again to Dr. Barbara Nadesan-Horowitz, to Dr. Sammy Ramsey, and to Dr. Jaime Modiano. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of Aspen.
Thanks,
and if you have any questions, feel free to ask us, and go home and hug your dogs and your cats and thank them for their health and what we've learned from it. Take care, everyone. Bye.